No, I did a Sky News interview from Liverpool about a week or 10 days or so ago, and it went viral. It has been seen by millions of people. It has been liked, shared, retweeted, and otherwise appreciated or depreciated by a truly gigantic audience. I thought it was fading from the public memory, but it just came back. The former mayor of Sunderland, a Labour heartland, but one where they're distinctly vulnerable on the old Brexit front, was this week suspended from the Labour Party for sharing my Sky News video on his Facebook page. I thought myself that a kind of Rubicon was crossed then, not just because it involved me personally, but because the sharing of something on one of the country's main news broadcasters on Facebook would seem to be, well, the most innocuous of pastimes. The man who shared it was no fan of mine, as the words that he added to the video made clear, but he just thought that I was right on this occasion on that broadcast. And he's been suspended from the Labour Party for it. That's the former mayor of Sunderland, still a councillor in Sunderland, in fact a cabinet member in Sunderland, and coming hard on the heels of the suspension of Chris Williamson MP and immediately presaging the suspension of the prominent intellectual journalist and commentator Asa Winstanley from the Labour Party, shows that what I said last week is true, that Tom Watson is now effectively calling the shots in the Labour Party. I had a deluge of Corbyn cultists insulting me on Twitter when I came off air last Friday night. People who believe that whistling in the wind will get you through. People who believe that the wish is the mother of the fact, and of course it isn't. There is nothing inevitable in politics. No one's victory is inevitable. No one's record speaks for itself. Everyone is only as good as their last result. And Jeremy Corbyn is on a run of form that Stoke City would recognise. His ratings are plummeting. His ratings are going through the floor. The Labour Party's ratings are falling, and Corbyn's are falling faster and further. However, he seems determined to adopt the rope-a-dope approach to it all, just to absorb blow after blow after blow after blow. But you see, Ali had a plan with rope-a-dope. The question is, does Jeremy Corbyn? Ali decided to absorb blows for a given number of rounds, calculating that George Foreman would punch himself out. And he was right. His plan worked. And very quickly, Foreman was flat on his back, and Ali was the champion of the world again. Now, obviously, I hope that that happens in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, but my faith in that is negligible, because it seems to me self-evident that far from tiring themselves out, Corbyn's enemies are gaining new and greater strength. Their punches are getting harder. His failure to even shape up in order to absorb the blows more and more evident. So Corbyn cultists, look away now. I never signed up to blind faith. I have no blind faith in anyone except the Almighty. I will not pretend that things are going well when they're going badly, because that's a guarantee of utter dismal failure. And I said last week that I doubted whether Corbyn any longer had it in him to fight back. This week has done nothing to dissuade me from that point of view. As a matter of fact, constituency organisations and trade union organisations are being stopped from passing motions in support of Chris Williamson, whose crime, I remind you, was to be Corbyn's most loyal parliamentary lieutenant, a man who put in more miles, more shoe leather in support of the Corbyn project than any other parliamentarian. But he's out. I'm out. Jackie Walker's out. Ken Livingstone's out. Mark Wadsworth's out. Thousands of people are out, and we ain't coming back in. Meanwhile, Corbyn's enemies get stronger and stronger and stronger. I'm willing, of course, to debate that with anyone, and no one is sadder than me to have to utter the words I'm now uttering. But if there's one thing I stand for in politics, which is, I think, quite widely recognised, I try to tell the truth as I see it, and I will not tell lies to anyone about anyone or anything. That's why I want to say, as I said when I stood against him to be the London mayor, that Sadiq Khan is not just small in stature. He is the smallest figure ever to occupy such a large political job in any part of the world at any time. He is vanishingly small as a mayor, and it's getting very serious. Oh, sure, he'll turn up to any identity politics jamboree. He'll turn up to any interview that allows him to virtue signal on everything but his job. His job is first and foremost to ensure that Londoners are safe. And Londoners have never been less safe, ever, in peacetime history. There have been 6 fatal stabbings in London in the last 7 days. Murders are taking place in the capital, all over the capital, in leafy lanes and in urban jungles, in the concrete jungles of the post-war developments where young people were dropped and abandoned without facilities, without services, without anything to do except congregate as gangs, and on the leafy lanes of the posher, more expensive parts of the city, almost equally. And all kinds of people are being stabbed. Young people, old people, black people, white people, male people and female people. And where's the mayor? Has the mayor been in? Well, he was on Peston the other night, where his principal purpose was to heighten and further the coup against Jeremy Corbyn. He'll always turn up for that. But answer had he none to the crisis of insecurity being felt by millions of Londoners. Millions of them are talking of little else than whether their children will come home tonight or whether they'll get that knock on the door to tell them that their child is dead, or that their child has caused the death of someone else, which is, of course, also utterly devastating to the lives of everyone concerned. Now, I know that the police cuts in Britain are primarily responsible for the rise in crime. The police cuts, the decade of austerity, the slashing of youth services, and anything that would remotely resemble an infrastructure that would allow our young people to grow up in a positive environment. I know that the government is primarily responsible for that. But I've got to tell you, as someone who stood for the position, there's actually not much of a job in being London mayor, except occupying a giant pulpit, a bully pulpit from which you can opine, talk, cajole, shout, demand, organise public opinion behind what is right. So, Mr. Khan, Mayor Khan, if the problem is police cuts, what are you doing about it? If the problem is cuts to youth services, what are you doing about it? And the answer is as little as the man himself. He is a political disaster, a failed experiment. He should never have been chosen. He should never have been elected. Now, we tried to get hold of him for this show. Not for the first time or even the 10th time. In fact, I think he has never been on talk radio. I'll be contradicted if I'm wrong. His press team said he'd done enough media. No, you haven't done enough media, Sadiq, because the people are singularly unreassured. So, if you're listening and you're not so tired now, give us a call. 0344 499 1000. Now, the week that's coming up is the most important week in British political history since the Norway debate and the fall of Chamberlain, the assumption of the premiership by Winston Churchill, when Hitler was at the Channel ports and when Britain stood alone. Only our Air Force and our Navy there to stop them. That's a big claim, but it's one I make without fear of contradiction. Because this coming week will determine the rest of your life and the rest of your children's lives. This coming week will decide whether the democratic decision by the British people to leave the European Union is honoured or not. And if it is not, grave political consequences, unforeseen, entirely unforeseen in some cases, political change will occur as a result. And if we do, what matters next is on what basis we do. Now, I'm one of those who has longed for this day, longed for this opportunity, because I see it as an opportunity. Not as a problem that has to be managed, not as damage that has to be limited. There's nothing negative about how I approach this coming week and what it can mean for this country and our people. I look forward to a future with hope, where we, as an independent country, can slip our moorings from a fading, failing collection of some European states and sail off into and around the world again. I want Britain, post-Brexit, to be what it was in the swinging 60s in London, in Carnaby Street, in the Apple Studios, when we were the cultural capital of the world, when we made ships of steel, when we had a car industry, a shipbuilding industry, a truck building industry, a van building industry, a motorcycle building industry, a railway workshop industry, when we had a steel industry, when we had a coal industry, when we were something. We were not, as I keep saying, painting our faces blue and living in the forests before we joined the European Union. We were something. And, moreover, we were far more advanced on workers' rights, on women's rights, on the rights of people to a clean environment, on the rights of gay people to live their lives freely, on many other rights. We were way, way ahead of most, if not all, of the member states of the European Union. We did not require them to civilize us. Neither do we require them. In fact, to the contrary, we require to be out of the European Union if we are to be free to elect a government which will make a Britain that's better for you, me, and all of us. There are not many people who have approached the Brexit 3 years that we've lived through with that frame of mind. In fact, I'd go further. I allege that there was a secret compact between the British state and its government and foreign states and the EU to make as little of Brexit as possible, to make as small a Brexit as possible, a Brexit, if possible, in name only. And that's what might pass next week. That's Brino. Brexit in name only. It may pass in the House of Commons next week, in which case I put the political class on notice that the story isn't over. There are some of us who will fight and fight and fight again for a proper, clean break from the European Union. I was just on television earlier today, on American television, and I was making the point that International Women's Day was invented and organized for the first time in 1910 by two Russian women. These two Russian women were Bolshevik women, Clara Zetkin and Alexandra Kollontai. And they first called it International Working Women's Day. And of course, all women work. They either work for an employer, or they work at home, or they work for an employer and they work at home, and they're exploited and treated unfairly in both of their workplaces. And so I'm hoping that men will think tonight about the meaning of International Women's Day and about the importance of women and men uniting, properly uniting, working as a team against the existential problems which exist outside of the home. And we're going to be looking for music that makes that point. Now, my first guest this evening is my new best friend. I'm enormously impressed by him. You can see my interview with him on my television show on Sky 511 on Sputnik. Tomorrow you'll see it 5 times if you'd like to, from the early morning till late at night. Dr. Gerard Lyons is the chief strategic economist. He has worked for all of the important citadels of financial power in the City of London. He's a non-executive director of the Bank of China. He is a man at the top of his profession in the dismal science of economics. But he's far from dismal, and he has far from a dismal outlook on the subject of Brexit, as I discovered when I interviewed him yesterday for tomorrow's television show. Now, it goes without saying that he's speaking tonight in a personal capacity. None of these great banking houses probably agree with him, and certainly he's not speaking for them. He's co-author with Liam Halligan, another friend of mine, of the Daily Telegraph, of a book called Clean Brexit, How to Make a Success of Leaving the EU. Dr. Lyons, welcome to the show.
Good evening. Pleasure to be on.
Only a few days to go. Are you any closer with your ear to the ground to working out what's going to happen next week? What are the likelihoods?
Well, obviously, it's still hard to call. It's based on raw politics. But my working assumption is still the same one as I've had for the last few months, which is that we'll see a last-minute change, a face-saving change to the backstop that would allow the Brexiteers to support the Prime Minister's deal.
That's the change that everyone insisted the EU would never make.
Well, they haven't made it yet. And to make it, they need to give the UK a unilateral ability to opt out of the backstop or put a time limit on the backstop. Now, it's still possible that even after the shenanigans of the coming week, that even if the Prime Minister's deal is not approved, that the EU could yet, ahead of the summit on March the 21st, still deliver that. But if that face-saving deal is delivered, then at least it guarantees that we leave the European Union at the end of March. If it's not given, then the Prime Minister's deal in all likelihood will fail, and then the parliamentarians probably will rule out no deal, and then we're into the situation of a possible extension, who knows for how long, of Article 50, and therefore not leaving the EU at the end of March.
Let's deal with the last point first. I believe that it is enormously underestimated in this country what the political implications of this delay would be, especially as it's likely not to be a delay of weeks. perhaps not even of months, but maybe years. The implications of such a decision that was given to the British people to make, not then being implicated, I believe are being consistently underestimated by the political class, by the media class, but also the economic uncertainty that would accompany that. I believe that's being underestimated too. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. First, in terms of the politics, given all the factors that you've mentioned, which I agree with, I think that it makes sense for Number 10 and also for the EU to try and actually come up with this face-saving change to the backstop. Certainly many of the key people on the continent are leaving their watch soon. The parliamentarians here would not like to extend Article 50, really, the truth be told. And of course, if we did see it extended, then it's difficult in my mind to see how we can avoid having European elections this summer. In economic terms, whichever economy one's looking at, whether it's Britain or Germany or indeed any other, the outlook depends on the interaction between the economic fundamentals, policy and confidence. And confidence is a key factor influencing not just investment decisions, but listeners to your show, those people who feel confident are more likely to go out and spend. Those people who are uncertain, lacking confidence, will basically save more or spend less. And therefore, if we extend Article 50 and we have a further period of uncertainty, I think that will be a drag both on the UK and more particularly on the European Union economy as well.
And of course, it would guarantee another X months or years of debate about if and on what basis we're going to leave the EU, rather than how are we going to make a success of it.
That's right. I think in terms of all the possible options this week, we haven't yet talked about no deal. And I think it's worth stressing that there's naturally a lot of fear-mongering about no deal. And the key issue about no deal is how much preparation has been made. Some firms are clearly prepared, others are not. We're not yet clear whether the government is fully prepared. That's very opaque indeed. But even if we had a no deal, for instance, it's important to stress that that's not an end state. That's a stepping stone. And if we were to actually go down the route of a no deal, which seems unlikely at the moment, then that would actually lead, in my mind, to later this year to a whole series of sector deals between the EU and the UK. Clearly, if we went down the route of an extension of Article 50, I think you're quite correct. It actually leads to a lot of uncertainty, both about when we actually were to leave and also on what terms. Therefore, bringing it all together, the best way to approach all this in economic terms is to actually make that change to the backstop. And the reason to stress making the change to the backstop is this, George. For the UK to make a success of leaving the EU, and I think we clearly can make a success of leaving the EU, we need to get three things right. They're all different, but they're all interlinked. One is to actually have a domestic economic agenda aimed at delivering growth. Second is to actually have a good, sensible relationship with the EU. And third is to position ourselves with the rest of the world. Not necessarily in those orders, but those three key factors. The challenge with the backstop at the moment is it ties our hands in the future on domestic economic policy, and it also ties our hand in the future in terms of our future trading relationship with the rest of the world. That's why the backstop, in my mind, needs to be changed. If we then have the withdrawal agreement and the political statement, which are the other parts of the Prime Minister's deal, then I can live with those, and I imagine many Brexiteers as well could live with those.
I'm more critical of Theresa May's deal than you are. Tell us why you think, from the standpoint of someone supporting Brexit, it's not as bad as perhaps I say it is.
Well, I don't think the Prime Minister's deal is as good as it should have been. I don't think we've approached the whole process in the right way. I think we've been a supplicant throughout, and I don't think we've actually seen it as the opportunity. Indeed, earlier you were talking about opportunity and sail-off. I view the EU as being like the Titanic. There's a tendency to think because it's big, we should be on it. But just as people were seeing the Titanic leaving the harbour on the day thinking it looks great, it's big, the EU, like the Titanic, did not change course, and it sank without trace. Those people who were lucky enough to jump into a lifeboat survived. And in many respects, the 2016 referendum allowed the UK to jump off the Titanic. We now have the ability to sail into the brand new world, facing the fact that 90% of growth in coming decades will come from outside the EU. The challenge with the Prime Minister's deal, particularly the backstop, it's like throwing an anchor back to basically hook us up with the Titanic again. So I certainly think the backstop is the very bad part of it. The rest of it I don't think is as good as it should have been, but at least it guarantees that we leave, and then it's very much about positioning ourselves thereafter. But I don't think the Prime Minister's deal in its entirety clearly is seeing Brexit as an opportunity. I tend to think both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have seen it as making the best of a bad job, whereas in my view it's clearly an opportunity to actually move us away from the slow growth region of the world economy, which is the European Union, and at the same time recognise the fact that the UK is an incredibly imbalanced economy, faces many homegrown problems, but at least in the future we'll have a lot more room for manoeuvre if we leave correctly to start addressing those and position the UK economy to grow strongly.
Lastly, Doctor, I'm grateful for your time. I mentioned earlier the tendency of the liberal elite, small l, liberal elite in Britain, to paint the EU as if it were some kind of civilizing mission without which we would have been savages. Equally, there's an absolute blindness in the British political and media class to the extent to which the EU is on the European mainland actually falling apart. You mentioned European Parliament elections. Every forecast is that the European Parliament elected this summer will be overwhelmingly anti-EU.
That's correct. But also look at it just in economic terms. Just take the last few days. Yesterday, the European Central Bank, their version of our Bank of England, basically had to acknowledge that the Eurozone economy is performing very poorly. Therefore, the European Central Bank will have to add more stimulus and will have to delay any rate hike until next year at the earliest. So the European Central Bank basically acknowledged that the Eurozone economy is very weak. Then a couple of days earlier, the OECD, which is a Paris-based independent organisation, they cut their forecast for the UK. That made all the headlines here in Britain. But they actually cut their forecasts more for the likes of Germany and France. So even the northern European economies are under-delivering. If you go to southern Europe, whether it's Spain, Italy, Greece, you have high rates of unemployment. And I'm still staggered in the debate here in the UK, this idea that we're throwing away our children's future by leaving the EU. Complete and utter nonsense. The European Union, unfortunately, under-delivers. It results in high rates of youth unemployment, particularly across the southern European economies. When you look at the data from the Home Office in terms of where UK people migrate to and where people leave the UK to go and work, if you're looking for work and leaving the UK, you basically don't go to the European Union. The people who leave the UK to go to the EU are those people retiring. If you're looking for better growth opportunities, people tend to look to other regions of the world economy. So I think we need a reality check. Clearly, we want the EU to do well. Clearly, we want it as our neighbour to actually perform well. But it is, as President Macron outlined in The Guardian and in other newspapers this week, it is a political project. And we basically have our own parliament. At least when we leave the EU, whatever people think about politics, at least then your MP is held to account more. And we can actually start to cut apart, and I think delivers greater growth and better opportunities for Britain and our people in the future.
Dr. Lyons, thanks very much indeed for joining us. That was Dr. Gerard Lyons, a very senior and important strategic economist and a governor, not a governor, a director of the Bank of China. Hassan Diwan says, kindly greet the person I brought along with me to listen to the show this week. Consuelo Griego. Many thanks, Consuelo. You're most welcome. We like new students here at the Open University of the Airwaves. Let's talk to Nicola in Swindon. Go ahead, Nicola.
Good evening to George. I listened to your monologue at the beginning and I agree wholeheartedly with what you said about Brexit, because that's the exact same reason that I voted out. I mean, I'm 67 years old now. We managed before we was in the EU. We had all those industries, bus, truck, rail, air. If we wanted it, we made it. Yeah. We even made our own nuts and bolts. We made everything.
Exactly, we did, yeah. We were still the workshop of the world in the 1960s.
And we're panicking now about stockpiling stuff rather than thinking
watercress.
about
I saw someone someone complaining that it's blaming Brexit for the shortage of watercress in Waitrose the other day. Well, we'll either have to do without our watercress or we'll need to grow it ourselves. It's not beyond us, Nicola.
We've got our own water. We can grow it.
We're talking about water actually in the second hour. Good that you brought that up. Yeah.
Listen to that. Well, all these industries that have been privatised rather than nationalised. It's done us no good at all. Nobody's gained out of it. We haven't got a choice. We certainly haven't got a choice with water. But I'll go back to Brexit. I mean, you look at the rail industry. If we wanted to make trains, we made them ourselves. We had people here, skilled people who could do these things. Now we import trains from Europe, which probably are fine in Europe.
And we're forced to by the European Union rules. Yeah. We're unable to prefer our national railway workshops.
But we get them here, and it takes 2 or 3 years to get them to work on our railways because our systems are different to theirs. And we've got the mix-up with sort of a semi-metrication system we use here, where half the people thinking miles and feet and things like that. And I nearly said chains and furlongs as well.
Well, I still think in chains and furlongs, Nicola,
well,
so there you go.
In the railway industry, you probably realise
I'm the last man standing talking about the final furlong, apart from racing enthusiasts.
Yeah, well, that's it. The railway and the horse people are the only people who still use chains and furlongs, which we manage quite well, and then somebody introduces this metrication system on top of that, and I don't think in that. I mean, I can work it out, but I do not think in meters and things like that. And we didn't go into it fully. We haven't gained anything out of it. We haven't got any contract.
Well, if we had, Nicola, we wouldn't have voted to leave it. The reason we voted to leave it was because the state we're in is such that 17.5 million people thought this isn't working for me. Yeah. I want to try something else.
Yeah, but on the railway, I dealt with initially with the ships out of Holyhead and out of Harwich, and I know that we imported far more than we exported.
Oh, for sure. There's a big trade imbalance with the European Union.
My job was finding empty containers to get out there. And then when we opened the tunnel, I was one of the duty managers who looked after the freight that we used to bring through the tunnel. And part of my job, again, was to get the empty wagons back out into Europe to bring stuff back. Mm-hmm. All right, we did export cars. We probably don't export as many of them now as we used to. But we used to import an awful lot of cars as well.
For sure, and that should concentrate the mind of the EU this weekend when they weigh up what they're going to make as their final offer or perhaps penultimate offer. As the professor said earlier, they sell a lot more to us than we sell to them. Nicola, thanks for the call. Wonderful to hear from you again. Daniel is in Addleston, always worth hearing. Daniel, go ahead.
Hi, good evening, George. How are you?
Yes, good, thanks. Fighting fit.
Keep fighting, mate.
Thanks.
Well, you're inspiration, mate, you are. A bit of a downer today. I mean, this knife crime business is, sorry, even that in itself is not correct, is it?
You're right. I have to stop reading these stories halfway down, as the father of 4 young children myself, and with my eldest child having 4 young children of her own, this kind of thing really haunts me. It sends a shiver down my spine.
But, this is the week also that the inquiry into alleged abuse of children linked to Westminster started, correct?
I don't know if it did. It went over my head.
No, independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. It was set up by the then Home Secretary, Theresa May.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming, that one.
Well, the point is while this is going on, my question is, are there still school visits to Westminster? And
well, look, Daniel, of course there are many school visits to Westminster. I've got no evidence at all that any child is in danger of the kind you are implying in going to Westminster. I used to always enjoy schools coming to Westminster, and I think they enjoy it. There are historical allegations many of which have now been entirely debunked, I should say, proven to be false and the product of fantasy. But there are many, many other examples, not necessarily linked to Westminster, of systemic abuse of children in this country over many decades. Church people, football club people, sports club people, scouts, and all kinds of things. I myself was a victim of that in the 1960s. So I'm here to tell you it's a real thing. And let's hope.
What's being done about it?
Well, let me read to you what's been done about it. A 3-week-long investigation into allegations of child sexual abuse involving politicians and Westminster officials opens on Monday. Is that next Monday? Yeah. With senior police officers, former ministers and the security services expected to give evidence. Potentially explosive claims will be made about whether parliamentary whips offices withheld information about criminal offences in order to exploit it, and whether detectives were warned off making inquiries into prominent public figures. The latest strand of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, chaired by Professor Alexis Jay, will examine some of the most sensitive accusations it has received. That's the report in The Guardian. Daniel, thanks very much for bringing that up. We'll no doubt discuss that next week. Let me read a couple more. Don't forget, we're talking about knife crime in the second hour, and indeed in the third. We're talking about the murder wave, which has reached even leafy Cheshire, a particularly distressing case where 2 boys have been charged, one with murder and one with being accessory after the fact. Both 17 years old, living in very, very expensive houses, attending very expensive private schools. And just en passant, I was very surprised that the accused in the case of Yusuf in Cheshire was given bail. But I was more surprised that the judge said he had no obligation to explain to the public why he had decided to give the accused person bail. Certainly not usual to give the accused in a murder trial of stabbing someone to death bail. I'm just wondering how that happened. And I really think the judge has an obligation to explain to the public that pays wages how that happened. The Communicipalist says, as you know, George, I support Brexit because the status quo is simply unsustainable. The life support systems of planet Earth are being contaminated by corporate profiteering. Something had to stop the rot. To me, Brexit is the first step towards that end. And Martin says 83% of Labour Party members voted to remain in the EU. Why can't you and your fellow Brexiteers accept a democratic people's vote? Well, I've no idea where that figure comes from, Martin. No one has polled the members of the Labour Party to see how they voted, at least so far as I'm aware. But just in case you didn't know, I'm not actually in the Labour Party. And I'm not bound by any opinion held within it. Now, an anonymous text. Think it's disgusting that MPs have given themselves a rise roughly in line with inflation. Next thing you know, they'll get paid 64 grand working for RT. I've no idea who gets paid 64 grand working for RT, but thanks for the 25 pence again. In fact, the flow of 25 pences that you send us every Friday. Now, this is Simon Booth. At least he puts his name on it. Very handsome avatar too. Says, listen up, you poo stirrer. I live in Hampshire, which is one of the world's largest producers of watercress. Stop spouting your nonsense and scaremongering. I voted leave and regret it every day. People like you are a huge problem. You and your sheep. my sheep. You are a watercress producer who voted leave and now regret it every day. I think you should maybe feed yourself some watercress, maybe improve your avatar. We'll be talking about knife crime. We'll be talking about Brexit. We'll be talking about Labour. We'll be talking about all the great issues of the day, including the crisis in water. Now, we talk about burning issues on this show every Friday night, thanks to Talk Radio. But we also talk about underlying issues that are not burning, but should be. Issues like the environment, issues like poverty in Britain, issues that are ignored elsewhere. And one of those is the crisis in water. Now, all over the world, the despoiling of the environment is first manifested in the poisoning and the depletion of the water table, the water supply. Of course, there are countries like ours where it's teeming down outside, where God favours us with a very considerable deluge of water every year. But even here, water is wasted, water is despoiled. But in countries like India and many other parts of the world, water will be the issue on which future wars are fought. We're used to wars for oil. It won't be that far distant in the future that we'll be seeing wars over water. Some people, some clever people, are doing their best to tackle it, to highlight these problems. One of those is Christopher Gasson, who's the chairman of Global Water Leaders. That's a group of utilities. Now, they exist to make the world of water work better. They achieve this by tapping into the expertise of water leaders from across the world to share their ideas and experiences. And Chris's biggest worry is northern India and the farmers using groundwater. Groundwater levels are decreasing. They're digging deeper, but pumping out unsuitable water. And that has led to an increase in farmer suicides due to failing farms. 300 million peasant farmers in 20 to 30 years. That's 300 million peasant farmers in just 20 to 30 years will have no water to farm. And in 2018, we achieved day zero in Cape Town, one of my favourite cities in all the world, where they almost literally ran out of water. Christopher's been good enough to join us on the line now. Christopher Gasson, thanks for coming on the show.
Hello, George.
Kindly describe the extent of this crisis first, if you would. Then we'll go on to what caused it, could it have been avoided, and how can we avert it?
Well, I guess it's the first thing to think about it is a sort of multi-local rather than a global crisis. I mean, different bad things are happening with water in different places, but the overall picture is the same, i.e. there are more people in the world and the same amount of water, and that puts pressure on water resources in different ways around the world. And, you know, as you mentioned, in sort of northern India, you've got peasant farmers who really need the water to irrigate their crops, and the state governments provide free electricity to pump groundwater. And, gradually that water is going away. And as it gets used up, it gradually becomes more saline, or it actually gives way altogether. And then the farmers have no livelihood. And these are some of the poorest people on earth. So, that's one sort of crisis. Cape Town is another sort of crisis where you've got essentially the impact of climate change, that you get more severe droughts and floods. And, they had a very severe drought, which nearly, finished them all off. I mean, you can't live for more than 100 hours without water. There's different kinds of crises around the world.
Climate change is obviously devastating in certain parts of the world. Nobody expected a modern city like Cape Town to actually run out of water. Was there an element of bad management there? or was it purely down to the climate?
I think that bad management of water is sadly rather prevalent all over the world, in that people like the idea that water is a gift from God and it's a sort of human right and it should be free, but actually it needs to be paid for. You need to have infrastructure in order to purify it and collect it and distribute it. And if you don't want to pay for it, you end up with not getting it, and that's one of the sort of central problems globally.
Of course, there are ways of paying for it without the individual paying directly for how much they're drinking or using and so on. That's a slightly separate political issue. But you're right to say there are more people in the world than the same amount of water, but the development of science and technology ought to mean, oughtn't it, that more of the water that we have can be used again and again.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, essentially, what happens with water is it comes out of the sky and gets collected and used. Some gets used and then ends up in the sea. And the problem is when it gets to the sea, it becomes salty, and taking the salt out is an extremely expensive process. So the more that you can, use your water before it gets to the sea, the better it is. And either that is, directly by having a wastewater treatment plant, treating water to a high quality and then, putting that into the drinking water plant, or indirectly by putting it into the River Thames, and, it goes through, 40 times or something before it gets to the mouth of the Thames.
Now, you've said how we got here. So how do we avert this coming crisis?
Well, as I say, I think that the crisis is in different shapes in different places. I think that there are two things: either you change your habits or you change your technology. And some people are quite reluctant to change their habits. They obviously like to have green lawns and swimming pools and washing machines and so forth. And in those cases, changing the technology, i.e., having desalination or other technologies to sort of improve water efficiency as the alternative.
Isn't desalination the answer? After all, about 80% of the globe is covered by ocean. That's a lot of water. It's a lot of salt too. But we are in the 21st century. We can send people to the moon and spacecraft to Mars and so on.
I mean, it is absolutely an answer for a lot of people, particularly if you're living on the coast and you've got a reasonable income level. If you're living inland, like these Indian peasant farmers, and you've got a very low income level, it's very, very difficult to know what the solution is.
So you meet up with these water leaders. Would it be fair to say there's a sense of impending crises at these meetings? Are you just down about it?
No, it depends on where one's talking about. In places like the Netherlands and Singapore, or even Los Angeles, they've got very together water leaders who really know what they need to do, and they're able to win support of their population to make the investments that they need to make. I think the most desperate sort of situation I've come across is actually I met the water minister for Gaza a couple of years back, and that's a place where I just don't see a solution. I mean, he's got 1.8 million people. They're dependent on the groundwater. As they use the groundwater, they suck the seawater into the aquifer, and as the seawater mixes with the aquifer, the water they drink gets saltier. And as it gets saltier, it starts to give them sort of, cardiovascular diseases and so forth. And, I've met up with him in Ramallah, actually, to talk about how we could get a desalination plant in there. And, it's one of these things which is, it's incredibly difficult. I guess there is hope, but, just getting things across the border into Gaza takes so long that, he calculated that just getting the trucks of materials into Gaza would take 100 years. to build a desalination plant.
Well, that's a pretty sobering point to end on. Thanks very much indeed for that, Christopher. Christopher Gasson, chairman of the Global Water Leaders. Bewley from Lincoln says, George, just a thought, if fracking is so freaking good for the US economy in job and energy creation, then why the interest in Venezuela? Very good question. Roger says, Galloway turning against Corbyn on talk radio. You can't make this up. And Lizzie says, I have to agree. The forces against a socialist government for this country have turned their considerable powers to destroying our credibility any way they can. I also hope we can turn this around. And Scouser Lar says, if only Corbyn would stand up for himself and his project as much as his supporters do. He's allowing himself to be a metaphorical punchbag for the Blairites, and it's very depressing to watch. Now, Renar Momal is CEO and co-founder of Daikoo Textile Systems. This is a good news story. You see, I talked about despoilation earlier, and this, I'm afraid, you can't separate these issues. Capitalism is about making the maximum profit for yourself and your company and your shareholders and the owners and the chief executives and the rest as you can. Capitalism has no morality. It doesn't think global except in global exploitation. It doesn't say, can't say, has a fiduciary duty not to say, well, I could make a lot of money this way, but I'll not make it because it will damage the environment. So one of the biggest contributors to water depletion and despoilation is capitalist industry. Here's a capitalist industry, and I've got to thank Eddie Temple Morris and Virgin Radio for bringing this story to our attention, really sincerely. Here's a story of a capitalist company which is actually coming up with totally revolutionary solutions which could actually transform the landscape, the waterscape in the world today. Renar, thanks for coming on the show.
No problem.
Now, you are the CEO, co-founder of Daikoo Textile Systems. The backdrop to this is that 20% of industrial water pollution comes from the dyeing of textiles. That's an extraordinary number. The Aral Sea has been entirely lost to cotton farming for the fashion industry. And that's resulted in the loss of livelihoods and food sources for the Uzbek community that lived around that sea. 80,000 chemical elements are used with water, 80,000 for fashion industry, making the water wastewater, non-recyclable water. You've come up with a solution to that. Tell us.
Well, thank you for having me on the show. The solution that we're bringing is quite simple, and it's based on a very old technology. We're using CO2, in English I think it's greenhouse gas, as the solvent to dye the fabrics and the yarns instead of water.
Why didn't anybody think of that before?
Somebody thought of this around 25 years ago in Germany. It was a German professor in a laboratory who invented this on a very, very small scale. But nobody picked it up and was trying to commercialize it. But in fact...
And yet, you just got to state it as you've just done, and the commercial possibilities of it look entirely obvious to me. Why do you think it wasn't picked up?
Well, we started to pick this up 10 years ago to try to scale it up. But I think 10 years ago, maybe even longer, nobody was even, I think, aware of the pollution of the textile industry. I think because of internet, the awareness of the people, social media, I think people are getting more and more aware. Governments are getting more and more aware. But I think 10, 15 years ago, I think the problem was there, but nobody saw it.
Now, just explain, give me an idiot's guide, because not many people will grasp how you can colour yarn and textiles from CO2. I mean, CO2 is air, breath.
Yeah. Well, let me give you then a small lesson in textile dyeing, and I'm starting with the dyeing in water. And let's say if you take a piece of polyester, you can dye the yarn or you can dye the fabric. And that's done on huge rolls, and then you need about 100 to 150 liters of water. You also need the pigment, but the pigment doesn't like the water, so you need loads of chemicals to drive the pigment into the textile fabric. The efficiency is about 50 to 60%, so about 40% of all the dye stuff, including the chemicals, needs then to be treated or gone into wastewater. What we're doing is we're using greenhouse gas, CO2. If you bring that under high pressure, and I'm talking really high pressure, about 250 bars, the CO2 becomes liquid.
Wow.
And in the liquid phase, we can use the pure pigments. It's the same pigments that you're using in water dyeing, but it does dissolve in CO2, so you don't need all the chemicals to dissolve it. So our efficiency is 99.9%.
Wow.
So the 0.1%, okay, that's still in the liquid CO2, but here comes the trick. You take off the pressure in a small step, it becomes gas again, and the little bit of pollution falls out, so you have it captured. It's not going into the environment. And the CO2, we reuse it for about 95%.
You can reuse 95% of the CO2.
The CO2 we're using, 95% we are reusing. And then, of course, the question is, why not 100%? Because to take out the last 5% of our high-pressure vessels, we need then a lot more electricity, and that means more CO2 emissions. So you better emit the last 5% than take it all out. But we are reusing 95% of all the CO2 being used.
This is such a revolutionary new force. It could try. I mean, if it's the case that 20% of industrial water pollution comes just from dyeing textiles, you could eliminate, therefore, 20% of all industrial water pollution just by switching to your incredibly impressive idea.
Yeah, that's true, but I have to make one remark. At the moment, our system is working for not for natural fibers. It's working for polyester and it's working for nylon. Let's say for cotton, it's on the drawing table in the R&D phase, but polyester and nylon is already 70% of the whole textile production worldwide.
Wow.
Most people think cotton is the biggest one, but that's not true. It's polyester and nylon.
So give me an idea of the volume of water. I mean, if 20% of all industrial water pollution comes from dyeing, what is the quantum of water being used being polluted in industrial processes?
Well, the total textile production, out of my head, in 2018, it was about 80 billion kilos of textiles was being produced. And if you take an average between, let's say, 90 and 130 liters per kilo is being used for dyeing textiles only. You can make the calculation how much wastewater that is.
Well, I'll try and make it. I certainly can't in my head. But it's truly, it's oceanic proportions of water, at least in my mind. And I'm right in saying that most of that cannot be recycled, cannot be reused because it's despoiled by the chemicals. There are ways to clean the water, and so that it's you can dispose it back into the sewage, but it's not the same quality as it was. And the funny thing is, all the chemicals you're filtering out, you need to do something with the chemicals, and that's what people forget. So people say, "Yeah, I'm treating my wastewater." Yeah, that's true. I'm going to give you a number just to show you how good at maths I am, Rainer. That is 12 trillion kilos of water.
Yeah, that's a lot of Olympic swimming pools.
Well, look, you're based in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Are you the world leaders in this then?
World leaders. If you look at the amount of the volume of machines that are out there now, we have now 12 complete systems in the market. yeah, we are the world leader because there's nobody else who has a commercial system with CO2 at the moment.
Well, congratulations to you and more power to your elbow.
Thank you.
We're going to have to crack this natural fibers issue, though. Can that be done?
We hope it can be done because it's a different way, and we are here completely dependent on chemists and chemistry because we need to find a chemical solution on the dye stuff so that it works in CO2 as well. But I'm hopeful.
Reiner Momal, co-founder of Daiku Textile Systems in the Netherlands. I take my hat off to you. This is Toby Hobson. A huge potential change for water supply will be the recent development of a cost-effective desalination device based around the superproduct of the coming century, graphene. Manchester University are leading the way on this potentially momentous discovery. Well, that doesn't surprise me because Manchester University, like many of our best, are amongst the best in the whole world, and that's a whole new Brexit discussion itself. Our language, our universities, our science base, our medical science base are a very significant part of our future. Let me read a few others. Charlie Fakel Ross says, here we go again. We beat Hitler. Let's go back to the 60s. Honestly, gorgeous. You really need to stop this nonsense. It's not healthy. Thanks for listening, Charlie, every week. Next Tuesday is my birthday. The best gift I could possibly wish for is a clean break and farewell from the Europrats in Brussels. It's a great pity that someone of your calibre hasn't been representing us. You give hope to a great many people. Great show, George, says Denny. Thank you for that, Denny. I must say it's been extremely frustrating watching the very shrunken political class negotiate the Brexit process. As I've said many times, it's a great pity that the Brexit cause was not properly represented in Parliament, except by a crew on the far right of the Conservative Party from whom you wouldn't buy a second-hand lawnmower. Dan El Rojo says Corbyn is a man of good intentions. However, his weakness over keeping the Blairites in with the naive belief in unity and his suicidal anti-democratic and unprincipled backing of a second referendum are both criminal betrayals of the working class. Shame on him, says Dan. Dan goes on, the working class is in desperate need of a mass socialist pro-trade union workers' party which will fully implement the will of the British people and leave the neoliberal EU entirely. Not one mass party offers that. And Mal, my old friend in Belfast, says, well said, re-Brexit. From day one, the Remainers in Parliament have done nothing but stifle, disrupt and plot for the UK to stay in the control of the EU mob. I feel that without doubt we are being edged into another referendum by their joint campaign of non-belief in ourselves and blatant lies of our total downfall and failure. But the days of reckoning are coming, and our democratic vote to leave will not just be overturned or pushed aside. Our Remainer MPs are a bunch of lily-livered chickens. That's Mal in Belfast's view. Terry Eaton says, George, we are so near to a true socialist government that we can't afford to allow Watson and his cronies to derail it. If we're not elected with Corbyn as leader, we'll go back to Blairism, and I couldn't stay in a party with that bleak prospect. And How at Thee says, with Brexit, what do you think happens if the EU trap us in using the backstop and a Brexit party win the UK general election? Will we be able to use Article 50 to leave again? Good question. I myself am involved in a new initiative called the Brexit Alliance. If you want more details on that, info@brexitalliance.net. I'll be holding a meeting on that in the next couple of weeks. If you want to come, write to me. Martin in North Somerset is on the line. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Martin.
Oh, hi, George.
Hi there.
This is not about Brexit, although I'm very interested in your new initiative, and I will look that up.
Thanks.
But no, this is about the whole water business. You know, the supposed shortage of water, and as you rightly pointed out, you know, the planet is
80% water. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, it's salty, and you can't drink that or put it on your plants. But we do have the process to desalinate these things, and the whole problem is this whole climate change agenda, because you have millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa and in India who are standing on vast reservoirs of fossil fuels, but of course they're not allowed to use them, and it's this whole climate change agenda which is basically saying to the developing world, sorry, we've got our flat screen tellies and our cars, and we're pulling up the ladder now. You can't use them, and I think it's disgusting. I think it's
well, you need balance, don't you, Martin? The fossil fuels has a negative impact. It does allow industrialization and so on, but it has a negative impact, and you might therefore...
Sorry, yes, but this has been massively exaggerated. This whole business about man-made CO2 in the atmosphere is hugely exaggerated. There has been up to 20 times more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the Earth's history than there is now, and the temperatures aren't going up nearly as fast as they said. Sea level rises aren't going up nearly as fast as they said they would. The whole thing is a political scam, and it has to be stopped because it's disadvantaging some of the poorest people on the planet.
Are you a scientist, Martin? What's your background? Because 97% of scientists disagree.
No. That figure's been debunked many times. That was put out by an Australian undergraduate, and they deliberately ignored anybody that disagreed with them. So it was a hugely skewed figure.
You're not contending that most scientists don't disagree with you, are you?
No, they were asked, do you think that a man-made carbon dioxide would increase, does have a greenhouse gas effect? Well, they can't deny that because any carbon dioxide will have that effect.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. But you didn't tell me what your background is. I mean, are you Martin from the chip shop in North Somerset, or are you Professor Martin?
Yeah, look, it doesn't matter what
it does. No, it does. It does. Because you mentioned the word agenda earlier. Have you got an agenda?
No, I want people to see the thing that it is, to see it as it is.
Yeah, but, people weigh up.
The whole thing has been exaggerated.
Yeah, well, but Martin, if I'm talking about Parliament, people can weigh up how likely it is that I'm right or wrong, because they know my background, my qualifications. So we're listening to you on climate science now. It's a legitimate question. Who are you? What are you? How much weight should we put on your view?
You shouldn't put any weight on my view at all. But what you should do is look into it and not just believe that this 97% figure is in any way indicative of the
all
situation.
Right. My last question: do you have a pecuniary advantage to be gained from arguing this line?
No, absolutely not. I'm a musician.
All right. That's all I wanted. You're a musician. Okay, you played quite an interesting song, Martin. We'll get a lot of response on it, I think. 0344 499 1000. Thanks for coming on the show, sincerely. Knitting Nanny says, I don't blame Corbyn. I blame Jenny Formby for being weak and MacDonald for being laughably naive in appeasing these people. Jeremy is Jeremy, a mild-mannered idealist. He did his job winning control from 500 to 1 odds. Time for others to protect him. Ian Aston in the West Midlands. George, I see the press are now cranking the Remain case in full force. The media is in top gear to dismantle our exit from the EU. The BBC and Channel 4 are doing their utmost to halt our exit. I think that the democracy of this country is at stake. I agree with that, Ian, but it's wrong to single out the BBC and Channel 4. Something very profound has occurred in the British media. Sky, which was owned by Mr. Murdoch, who owns this radio station, was once far more pro-Brexit and is now fanatically anti-Brexit. ITV is fanatically anti-Brexit. And the regulator notwithstanding, all four of these television stations are pumping out Project Fear, anti-Brexit propaganda 24/7. And much of their news coverage is led by newspaper headlines, newspaper front pages, which they review at 10 o'clock at night and which then drive their news bulletins all of the next day. And the newspapers too have changed. The Daily Mail was a fanatically pro-Brexit paper. It's now a fanatically anti-Brexit paper. The Times, again owned by Mr. Murdoch, was once a pro-Brexit paper, now a fanatically anti-Brexit paper. So the media landscape has dramatically shifted. That's all I'm saying, Ian. Let's hear from Rob in Blackpool. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, George. Enjoying the show.
Thank you.
First time I've had the pleasure of speaking to you. Basically, it's just I'd like your take on something that's really confusing me. I'm 65 this year, and I grew up in a reasonably diverse area of the north of England. And in no way in the memory of man could I be described as racist in any way, shape or form. But I was listening to the brouhaha regarding Diane Abbott and Amber Rudd, when Amber Rudd was actually sticking up for Diane Abbott for the abuse that she's had over the years, and more so recently apparently, and described her as a...
Well, half of all internet abuse,
yeah,
is suffered by Diane Abbott, one woman, a woman who's a black woman. So if Amber Rudd was sticking up for her, she was right to do so.
Sure, I appreciate that. But she described her, probably inadvisedly, because she's from the era that no longer knows, that has to walk on eggshells because they don't know.
No, she's not from that era. Come on, Rob. You and I are from that era. You and I are from that era. We're both 65 this year, but don't tell the wife.
Okay, George.
Look, she's not. Amber Rudd is not from that era. Okay. Amber Rudd's at least 20 years younger than you and me.
Well, I beg to disagree, because later on this afternoon on the Jeremy Vine on the car radio, there was a black lady on there that was saying that how disgraceful it was to describe Diane Abbott as a coloured person, because it's an insult to people of colour.
Well, look, you're right. There are eggshells. No, you're right, Rob. There are eggshells. There are eggshells involved here, and you can call people of colour, but you oughtn't to call people coloured, because by calling them coloured, people don't like it. It's like the word Negro. In Spanish, the word for black is Negro. And so you can use that in Spanish. But in English, it has extremely negative connotations. You must be able to see that.
Of course I do. But you must be able to see that my point. The point is that the black lady that was on Jeremy Vine pulling Diane Abbott to pieces, who I may add, I saw describing West Indian mothers as far superior to my mother.
She never said anything of the kind.
Oh, she did.
No, she didn't. Look, I heard what she said. Rob, you know, I know that it's normal to presage these kind of contributions with "I'm not racist," but, and that's what you seem to me to be now doing. She never said that West Indian mothers were far superior to your mother. She never said that. So don't claim it.
My mother per se, but
she didn't say it. You didn't. That's a grotesque paraphrase of what she said. Now look.
Why wouldn't she clarify it?
I heard her saying it. I saw her lips moving. She didn't say. There's nothing to clarify. She's nothing to clarify. What she said, she said. She meant what she said. She said what she meant. But she didn't say what you said. She said. Now, let's get back to this word coloured.
Everybody's entitled to paraphrase, Joe. It's not just you.
Well, no, everyone is entitled to paraphrase, but not if that paraphrasing distorts the words being described, and that's what you're doing now. And you've segued from a discussion of the use of the word coloured into a wholly, I promise you, wholly wrong attack on Abbott's views on West Indian mothers, because I was there when she said it. So I know what she said.
Second, please. It doesn't seem to be a level playing field when people...
What, between white people and black people? You're right, Rob.
Well,
there's no level playing field between white people and black people. White people have got a fantastically greater extent of power and wealth and privilege over black people. There's no level playing field on it at all. Now, let me deal with the point that you actually phoned up to raise. Coloured is not an appropriate word to use because we're all coloured. I'm coloured, kind of pink. Other people who drink are coloured slightly redder about the gills. Everyone is coloured. So it's not an appropriate word to use, and black people don't like it. So if black people don't like it, let's not call them it. Yeah? That's pretty obvious. But it's not the worst crime that Amber Rudd has ever committed. It's not the worst sin that Amber Rudd has ever committed. And if you'd let me, I would have agreed with you to an extent on that. But the one thing that you have to acknowledge is that whilst my old mother, aged 85, only might, make that mistake, Amber Rudd, a woman in her 40s, should not have made it. Let me go on to Martin. No, go on. Sorry, I thought you'd gone. Go ahead, Rob.
Perhaps the black lady on Jeremy Vine shouldn't have said it either, and she was considerably younger than Amber Rudd. But anyway, nice to talk to you, George.
And you. Thanks for calling, Rob. I appreciate it. Martin in Market Drayton. He's up next.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, George. Thank you for taking my call.
It's a pleasure. I like saying the words Market Drayton. I've never been there, but it's one of the most delightfully named places.
Well, it arose by any other name, perhaps.
Okay.
You'd have to come and see it.
Okay.
George, I felt like I might have been sitting outside the headmaster's office there for a moment, waiting to get dragged in.
No, don't feel that way. I'm sorry if I got too cross with the last caller.
No, not at all. I just wanted to make a point.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? I just want to explain something. I've known Diane Abbott for 35 years, and I know what she has put up with. I know the ringer that she's been put through. And I am automatically suspicious of people who want to attack Diane Abbott because I know her qualities, I know her failings and shortcomings, and I cannot dissociate attacks on her from her gender and her colour. That's just me. Anyway, Martin, go ahead.
George,
say exactly what you want to say.
I know exactly what you're saying. And what I'm going to say is definitely not an attack on Diane Abbott.
No, you're entitled to attack her, but it's just I'm entitled to defend her.
I'll just put my cards on the table, just for context.
Yeah.
I'm a lifelong Labour voter.
Okay.
I've always worked in the public sector. My wife and I are both were significant victims of austerity, economically, no other way, just economically. But I really despair about our political system at the moment and the politicians that we've got representing it.
You and me both. You and me both.
Levels.
I've never known a more shrunken political class than we've got now, Martin.
And I suppose one of the things that brought all of that to a head in my own mind this week was the exchange between Diane Abbott and Amber Rudd.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps I could explain it.
Yeah.
What I'm really thinking about was that Diane had an opportunity to take the higher ground,
mm-hmm.
to be magnanimous, to recognise that Miss Rudd's words, to be honest, had a positive intent. She didn't set out to cause offence.
She wasn't attacking her, she was supporting her.
Even though she did cause offence, but that was clumsiness and ignorance.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you, Martin.
But unfortunately, Diane, and I don't know if they're trained to do this or if it's just the way that they are, simply knee-jerked towards one word, ignored all the good intent and all that was going to convey to the listening.
When you say they, what do you mean they?
Well, when I say they, politicians of all ilks, I don't know what they're trained to do or what they're told to do, and whether they're doing what they're told or what they actually feel is right.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it gets done.
Well, look, Martin, we're running out of time in this hour.
What I was going to say is this, George, and it's really important.
Okay.
What example does it give to everybody else in terms of tolerance?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's an issue there about just an old money. You were talking about your old mother. My mother's the same. Good manners were built on kindness. Kindness is the sort of foundation of tolerance. So if you can't find a way to be kind when you need to be kind, in some respects you're being intolerant. And
well, look,
an opportunity there to just to say, I recognise what you're saying. What you're saying is correct, but you've just used the wrong words. Those words aren't acceptable. They are offensive, but we'll just let that one slide by.
Well, I agree. I've got to stop you. And I agree to an extent. I'm just going to offer you a very brief reason why. If half of all internet abuse against any public figure, 50% of all internet abuse has been suffered by you, then it may be that you're pretty sensitive to these kind of things. I agree with you. It would have been better if she had taken the high ground and accepted the positive things that Rudd was saying and made an en passant correction of that. I agree with that. And maybe even Diane Abbott will now agree. But when you've suffered the unremitting, systemized, industrialized, commercial and public abuse that Diane Abbott has suffered, you could, if you could walk in her shoes, Martin, and I can't either, but I can do so perhaps more than you, I assure you that it doesn't make you feel all that tolerant when you're attacked in a way that you think is unfair. Now, Rudd was not attacking her in an unfair way, quite the contrary, but maybe her antennae is just so finely tuned to being attacked that she felt she had to respond in the way that she did. There's a whole hour to come, and we're inviting you to share your stories, your memories of women who have inspired your life in honour of International Women's Day. Now, as I hinted just before the break, I underestimated Amber Rudd's age by quite a considerable margin. Shows what I know. Actually, she's 55 and not a woman in her 40s, as I said. So, to that extent, I owe an apology, not to her. I'm sure she's not offended by being told that I thought she was much younger, but to the earlier caller who made the argument that Amber Rudd came from an era when the use of the word coloured was the norm and was not in any way offensive. Now, it turns out that she's not as old as he was or as I am, but not as young as I thought she was. So to that extent, I was wrong. But Amber Rudd was the Home Secretary of Britain, for goodness sake. Has she ever seen a Home Office document that uses the description coloured for black people? I'm certain that she has not. She is a member of the liberal elite, where it ought to be the lingua franca by now, that this word is not the proper word to use. But I'm willing to be further corrected, 0344 499 1000. But I want to talk first to Sophie Lewis, who's a former editor at Pelrine Press and a translator, because Pelrine, am I reading this? It's Peirine, I beg your pardon, Peirene. Peirine is an independent publisher founded by and run by a woman. At Peirine, 60% of the authors and 70% of the translators are women. And Sophie is a former editor at And Other Stories, and they published only female authors in 2018, the year of publishing women. Now, literature is, of course, dominated by men, overwhelmingly, historically. Maybe Sophie will tell us whether it's catching up now, but I'm grateful to her for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Sophie, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you. I just have to say that Pyrene is said Pyrene.
I beg your pardon. I got it wrong. I got it wrong, pronunciation and spelling.
That's no problem at all.
Pyrene.
Yes. So women in books, in literature, absolutely right. You look historically, and they hardly get a chance to write. Sappho is the exception. But I think women in the Anglophone world in publishing don't have such a hard time of it. Looking overall, there are an awful lot of women who are well received, whose books sell an awful lot of numbers, a lot of copies, and who win prizes. But what we don't really read so much of is women coming from other languages and other cultures, women being translated into English. This is really a deficit in the literature that we get to read in English.
Well, I saw a rather good film about the French author Colette a few months ago. Before it arrived here, actually, I saw it in Norway. And Colette, of course, was published in the beginning as her husband.
Right.
Her husband pretended to be the author of the books that she was writing, and that was necessary commercially at that time.
Yes, these
and she's the greatest of all
used.
French writers, novelists anyway.
There's a perhaps shameful history of women having to write as men in order to launch their literary careers before they can admit to being women. I don't think it goes on actually now. I suppose I think perhaps we've managed to turn that corner, and we don't have to pretend that women are men.
Historically, there's the points you're making are completely incontestable. But when I look, and I'm regularly in an independent bookshop, one of the best in the country, award-winning. Every Saturday I'm in it. And there's a huge number of books now written by women.
Absolutely. There is, and I would say there probably deserves to be. There's some great women writing great stuff. I still think that women being translated are in the massive minority. And this
Do you mean from other European languages or further afield?
I mean both. I mean from anywhere, from everywhere. If the amount that we translate into English is pitifully small, which if you're talking about literature, it absolutely is. It's probably less than 1% of the stuff that we can buy in the shops. Then the amount of that is women in translation is again far smaller. And that is something that needs remedying and a conscious effort on the part of publishers. And it means really hunting hard, looking beyond the recommendations from the people that are tried and tested. It means hunting and reading and getting people who can read in many languages. And dare I suggest, listening to translators you've not spoken to before, that kind of thing.
Now, I'm thinking on the practical level, there are some jobs that historically were done by men, like going, hundreds of feet underground and digging coal or fighting in armies on the front line and so on. But writing is, I would have thought, the best possible pastime, best possible career for both men and women. There's absolutely no reason why a woman wouldn't be a good writer.
There's no reason why a woman wouldn't be a good writer, absolutely. The only problem is, there are two problems. One is finance, and the other one is the one articulated by Virginia Woolf so well, a room of one's own. And to that I would add a room with a door and a lock on it of one's own.
Yeah, good point. I wish I had that. I write 1,000 words every day, every single day. And because I have young children, a room with a lock on the door, it doesn't even work because they just bang on the door until they get in.
Of course,
and so
that is precisely the problem. That is the problem. Yeah.
A room of one's own. That's a very good quote. I like that. So given that women can write, at least as well as men. Given that more and more women are writing and more of their books are on sale, what's the problem then? We're set fair, aren't we?
We are set fair, but we are turning a big ship slowly, I think, as we find in many problematic fields. But this ship is, if you call it a couple of millennia of literature, this is a big ship and it moves very slowly. So places like Pairini Press are looking beyond our borders for the women writing so well as they are doing and being published in all kinds of parts of the world. And for example, Nora Ikstina's book, Soviet Milk, she's a Latvian writer. And to find a woman Latvian writer writing so well about women's experience, and then to find the translator and to publish it, this is a major exercise. So we are perhaps set fair, but without the effort that goes beyond just, a sample came to my desk. Without the kind of pioneering effort that Pairini does and that Micah Ziervogel at Pairini really works hard at, it's not going to happen often enough that these kinds of books are published in English.
Do you know this? Maybe you don't, but it would be interesting. Do men buy books by women, or is there a gender imbalance in purchasing habits? So, I mean, for example, half the population are women. Have you any idea what percentage of the book buying public women are, and are they more likely to buy books by women than by men, and are men less likely to buy books by women than men?
I don't have the stats at my fingertips. My guess, my feeling is that women might be a tiny majority, maybe 50-something with a decimal point or several, in the majority as a book buying published.
It's certainly true. That's certainly true in my bookshop, the bookshop I go into.
Right.
There are always more women customers than men.
But then the question of what women buy and what men buy, and whether they buy writing by each other, to put it crudely, is something that I don't know how you would track. Book data is not probably sufficiently sophisticated for that.
I see.
But then there's also the question of marketing. It's certain that women buy books that are directed at women, and men would not buy them because they don't want floppy pink covers, to put it again very crudely. So if you don't market books in that way with a kind of gender division, then you may not get such a division of purchases.
Yeah. That's an interesting.
I think that's again quite important.
Yeah, definitely an interesting.
In fact, where there is data is in the children's book market, and there is now a conscious effort not to have pink sparkly covers and 4 girls aged X to Y, on the back, so that boys can read the girls' books and girls can read the boys' books. In fact, the divisions and the distinctions will dissolve, hopefully, and are perhaps dissolving.
And are even being cleaned up in old books. There was one I was reading to my kids recently in which that was still actually quite sexist, but it had apparently been cleaned up in that regard.
Had been worse.
Yeah, the boys were doing all this kind of rough stuff, and the girls were baking cakes and so on. That was the cleaned up version. That's a whole different discussion, but it's a very interesting one, I think. Let me ask you what Pairini is doing at the moment. What kind of projects have you got on now?
Pairini is doing amazing things. Pairini publishes 3 books a year in its core list, always works of translation. 2019 will be all women writers. There'll be a French writer among them, and then 2 others that I don't quite recall, but all really fantastic and unusual, interesting, pulling writing from unusual places and in unusual styles. And then also Pairini is working with new writers and creating a series called Pairini Now, which is a curated series of writing about important issues of the moment. And I think perhaps Shatila's story is the newest book to come out of that. And that's a collection of stories written by refugees in the Shatila camp in Jordan. And that's been put together. So these are people who did not consider themselves writers initially, or perhaps in the beginning, and who've been given a chance to write, to be edited, and then to be published. And their stories are now published in this volume called Shatila Stories. And it's really quite a spectacular thing to have done. So Pyrene is doing pioneering work. It really is.
Fantastic. Now, 2018 was the year of publishing women. You've just said for Pyrene, so is 2019. It's International Women's Day. Was there anything special in the book writing, book buying world for International Women's Day? Do you know?
Anything special? Well, I mean, I think that everybody's doing their deal, so you can buy an awful lot of women's fiction, as in fiction by women or literature by women, I should say. Right now, if you look at various publishers' sites, they're all promoting what they've got. So that's a
Well, I'll tell you tomorrow. I'll be in my bookshop as normal tomorrow. I'll make a special effort to look out for the kind of stuff you've been talking about. Sophie, thanks very much for joining us. Sophie Lewis, former editor at Pyrene Press. Of course, Shatila, Palestinian refugee camp, is in Lebanon, not in Jordan. Not only do I know that, I lived in it for a short time. Your Vegan Coach says, apparently, she's a very smart lady, this Your Vegan Coach, by the way. She's a regular correspondent of mine on Twitter. She says, apparently, J.K. Rowling was asked to use her initials rather than her first name because it was thought boys wouldn't buy her books if it was obvious they were written by a woman. Very interesting observation, I must say. Let's take a call from Andrew in Aberystwyth. Andrew, welcome.
Hello, George. Nice to speak to you.
And you, sir.
I was just phoning up about your references to Diane Abbott. I mean, I personally don't think that she's attacking more on her race, but more on her idiotic comments, more than anything.
Well, lots of politicians make idiotic comments, but none of them are as savagely and massively attacked as her. So, excuse me if I smell a rat.
A rat? What do you mean?
The rat of racism.
I wouldn't say racism, you see, because my real argument against Diane Abbott is that she sent her son to a private school while telling the rest of us that we should, ordinary comprehensives are all right,
I wouldn't have done that, as you probably know, and I don't think she should have done that, and moreover, she thinks she shouldn't have done that. But there's at least half of all members of Parliament didn't send their own children just to private schools, but they themselves went to private schools. So why is her decision to send her son to a private school so salient in your mind?
Because her entire views on the comprehensive school system, and I thought she'd have been a bit, not such a turncoat on that issue.
Yeah, it was a very long time ago. I'm surprised it's still on the tip of your tongue.
Well, I just find it a bit hypocritical is all,
All right, that's noted. That's noted. That's noted. So move on to your next point, Andrew.
Oh, yeah, about global warming. You said that like 97% of scientists, that doesn't prove anything. That's just scientism.
No, it doesn't prove everything, but it must prove something. It must indicate. It must indicate something.
Well, 97% of scientists in the Soviet Union said Lysenkoism was a thing. 97% of doctors in Germany.
But we're not talking about the Soviet Union. We're talking about the entire world. Now, if it isn't 97%, and we can argue about that number, it is the overwhelming majority of scientists. Are you a scientist, Andrew?
Well, I don't think that really has anything to do with it.
No, you're the second person to say that tonight. If you're Andrew from the bookies on the corner, that matters to me, because I can put a certain weight on what you've got to say about climate science if you're Andrew from the bookies, and a different weight if you're Professor Andrew from Aberystwyth University Physics Department. Don't you see?
Well, George, like I was saying, I'm not prepared after the 20th century and the historical evidence we have to just have a blind faith in what scientists say after all.
No, I agree. I agree with that. I don't have blind faith in what anybody says.
That's just basically my point more than anything.
Yeah, okay. Well made. Thanks a lot. Let's talk to Anthea in Essex. Anthea, welcome.
Good evening, George.
Good evening to you, madam.
I'm going to do the unthinkable. I'm going to tell you my age. Well, not quite. But I will tell you that I'm of the right age to be Amber Rudd's only very slightly younger sister.
Okay, okay.
And,
okay.
And everybody can do the maths as they like. You know, when I was very young, back in the 70s, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and punk was young, my parents told me that if someone called me coloured, that I shouldn't get too upset because they were probably an old person and didn't know any better.
Mm-hmm.
And that was back in the 70s.
Yeah.
So somebody who was a 70 or 80-year-old person 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So 40 years ago, it was considered to be something not very nice. And back then, black people used to just put up with a lot of stuff.
Sure, and now they don't, and neither should they.
Well, exactly, which takes me to my next point. It's a sad irony that on International Women's Day, you've had a little queue of men appearing on your show to tell a black woman, Diane Abbott, or perhaps me, if I were in her shoes, that that black woman should just keep quiet if something happens that's wrong.
That's a good point.
Just let it go.
They've all been, dare I say, middle-aged white men that have phoned up to make this point.
Yes, and telling me or Diane Abbott that we should take the higher ground. Apparently, that the people who say something they shouldn't don't need to take the higher ground. It's the person on the receiving end who needs to take the higher ground. And that if they're required to make changes and adjustments to their behaviour for the sake of politeness or kindness or empathy, that is walking on eggshells. George, let me tell you something. You won't be surprised to hear this at all, in fact, that Diane Abbott was told that she should let it go by and just, forget about it and tolerate it. And I want to say, George, that you didn't get to be where you are today by sitting down and letting things go by or tolerating things you think are wrong. One thing we can't say about you is that you keep quiet if you think something is wrong.
No.
You don't do it. And so,
well, that's why I'm sticking up for her, because I know her, and I know that her intentions are good. And if she made mistakes...
On International Women's Day, women are always being told to shut up and be quiet and be nice girls. You see, the thing about it is that you are, even on your jingles, you sort of, in a jocular way, talk about your firebrand, your justice warrior activities, that you're a man who fights for justice, and people either do or don't like what you say, but you're going to keep going because it matters to you. But when a woman does it, be quiet, sit down, be nice, don't make a fuss, tolerate it, let it go by. Oh, how dare you have an opinion? And remember, her comment in response to what was said was, I think, quite elegant and restrained. She didn't come out with all guns blazing. She just said it was rather revealing a comment. And yet, because of that, we're told that she's somehow uppity. Did I say it?
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, which brings a man onto the telephone, onto a national radio show to talk about the decision she made about the school for her son 25 years ago.
And was she the only politician who told us that we should do something and then they did the opposite? Did not that nice Mr. Clegg tell us that faith schools were bad and then sent his child to a faith school?
And then there was that nice Mr. Blair.
Pardon me?
And there was the nice Mr. Blair. There's a list of them as long as your arm. But the only one they remember and want to talk about is Big Diane.
That's right. Well, big, bodacious Diane. And also, let's be honest, she's something of a lightning rod for those kind of comments. Why? Because there aren't enough brown women in Parliament. But there aren't enough. I mean, we're getting there. We are getting there. And, I think to a certain extent, it's just a sad little irony that on International Women's Day...
Yeah, it's a very good point. I wish I'd thought to make it. I wish I'd thought to make it myself. Thank you, Anthea. I'll always stick up for Diane Abbott because I'm suspicious of the motives of the people that attack her. That's where I stand. Laura in London, always worth hearing. Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to speak about Amber Rudd and...
Yeah, go ahead.
Angela Smith and Andrea Leadsom, actually. In the last couple of weeks, we've had Angela Smith mentioned funny, tinged people, just very casually in conversation on TV on the same morning that she claimed to be leaving the Labour Party because of racism. And I thought her own mindset leaked out in that show that morning. And then we have Amber Rudd very casually, again, doing the same thing, talking about coloured people or coloured women. Mm-hmm. And I didn't actually hear the show. I heard the recording afterwards, but I didn't hear if Jeremy Vine actually challenged her on that.
I don't know. I can't say one way or the other.
Well, if he hadn't, then that would be quite disappointing. But she also leaked out her mindset. And there's 2 years in age between Angela Smith and Amber Rudd. And I don't believe it's the age from when they come. I believe it's the household, the home, the circle, the gang, the clique. I believe that's where, because you don't read it on the forms when it says what ethnicity or what origin or whatever are you. It doesn't say are you coloured. And then
exactly, especially when you've been Home Secretary.
Well, yes.
But let me take an example. Baroness Una King, now in California.
Yeah.
None of the liberalati ever criticised her. Quite the contrary. They lionised her. But they don't lionise Diane Abbott. And the reason is Diane Abbott's politics as compared to Una King's politics. Una King was a Blairite inside the circle. Diane Abbott is a Corbynite outside the circle.
Yes. And then there's Andrea Leadsom, who I think was it yesterday or the day before, with regard to Islamophobia. I think she said
she said this was a matter for the Foreign Office.
And I when I heard that, when I saw it on TV, I thought, what?
She has the excuse of being stupid.
Well,
Andrea Leadsom is a very stupid woman.
Well, that kind of indicated to me that she seems to think that Islamic people, Muslims...
British Muslims were a matter for the Foreign Office.
Are a matter for the Foreign Office. So she doesn't see them as part of Britain. It's the other. So with all three, I feel that this is some sort of thing that leaks out from their mind when it leaks out into their language.
Well, that's right. And then you've forgotten one thing. The next day, the Northern Ireland Secretary made a gigantic, gigantic blunder, which has led her today to announce, I don't believe what I said. The wording, it's epic. I've never seen anything like it. I don't believe what I said. These are not my beliefs.
Wow.
Now, it was, as somebody put it on Twitter, it was like a 1970s boarding house. That the Tories put up this week. And the only people they didn't offend were dogs. Now, I'm told by my superiors that I must make clear that Andrea Leadsom cannot be stupid. She said a stupid thing. Well, I've got to tell my superiors, the Speaker of the House of Commons himself described her as a stupid woman. But I can't do that on radio, and therefore I withdraw it. Mr. Speaker, sir, I withdraw the remark. Laura, go on.
Well, I think I don't want to accuse those three women of racism, but I think racism is still alive and well. I think people don't regard themselves as racist or prejudiced.
Well, they're all, I'm not racist, but...
But there is a but in there. I think it leaks out in their language, and with all of those three women in the last 2 weeks, it certainly did leak out. And I just feel it's really disappointing that in this day and age this is still happening, and I think it's widespread as well.
Thank you, Laura, in London, as always. First-time caller, Melanie in Brighton. Go ahead, Melanie.
Hi, George. Nice to speak to you.
And to you, welcome. You're welcome on every level. You're a first-time caller, you're a woman, and it's International Women's Day.
I'm sorry that I'm not black, because that would be better. Because I wanted to make the point that what you were saying about you're not allowed to say that Andrea Leadsom's stupid, you're not allowed to say Karen Bradley's stupid, and yet we are allowed to imply that Diane Abbott is stupid.
Well, people on this station have accused Jeremy Corbyn of being an anti-Semite on this very station, from this very chair. But I'm not allowed to call Andrea Leadsom stupid. Go figure.
No, exactly. And I think the difference between the anti-Semitism and the way it's treated, if you compare that with BAME racism and Islamophobia, which are completely dismissed and ignored, and everything to do with anti-Semitism is heightened and treated as extremely important. I think that's very, very.
Well, both are. There's no hierarchy of racism. All racism is unacceptable and should be challenged and rooted out.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think all racism should be treated as one thing. I think Ocasio-Cortez spoke about that this week. She said that that if you don't treat racism as one system, it becomes classist and white supremacist. I'm on the radio. That's my daughter walking in. She has no
That's
problem.
That's fantastic. We've got your daughter on the show as well. I'm very, very happy about that.
I'm glad to say she will voice any opinion anywhere, anytime. That's what we want.
Absolutely, yeah, very definitely. Melanie, it's a joy to talk to you. I mean that sincerely. Don't be a stranger. Call back
You too.
anytime.
I was actually expelled from Labour for supporting you over a Blairite.
Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! I owe you a cup of tea and a scone. Next time you're up in London, give me a shout. Thank you, Melanie. How touching is that? Norma in Bristol. Norma!
Hello, George.
Thank you so much for the beautiful book, the British RSPB Handbook of British Birds.
Oh,
which
I hope you enjoy it.
I've got it sitting right in front of me, and I'll go through it in the morning with my children, and we'll see how many we can spot. It's very lovely of you. Thank you so much.
That's okay, George. I'm pleased to send it to you.
Thanks.
George, 3 little points. International Women's Day. The lady who did inspire me, or young woman, was Malala. She wrote a very good book and has spoken several times.
This is the young schoolgirl that was shot in Afghanistan. Am I right?
That's right. And she wrote a book. Actually, it was called Malala. And I read it quite a long time ago. But her promotion of education, primarily for women in Pakistan, she lives in Birmingham now because I don't think she's allowed to go back for some reason. But it was absolutely inspiring, and she was a marvellous speaker. That's my contribution to. That's
a very good
women.
contribution and a very good choice, Norma. Did you do anything special for International Women's Day? Did him and Doris do a bit more housework?
Well, he's lovely. I mean, we share. When we got married a hell of a long time ago, we agreed to share, so we do.
You've got to be a team. That's the point. This is. I'm glorying in the fact that that with my wife we are totally a team. We're together 24/7. We work together. We sit at the same desk together. We drink out the same cup. We're working literally out the same mug, and we're working. Totally working together in every way, bringing up the children together, working together, and she does a bit more of some things in the house than I do, but then I do a bit more of some of the other things, and it's working well.
I mean, we do argue, and I do boss him about.
Well, that goes with the territory. There's no married man listening to this who will say other than that their wife sometimes bosses them about.
But there is another point, George.
Yeah.
First, just quickly, I did love hearing your support and explanation for Diana, but I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I'm not going to go into any further on it because we've had some very good phone calls tonight from women.
I thought Anthea in particular was stellar, absolutely stellar. Somebody should give her a show, actually, or put her in Parliament. She's totally brilliant. She's like a burst of sunshine every time she comes on.
Yeah, but the other thing, quickly, I was upset about Chris Williamson's suspension.
I'm very upset about it, And I can't tell you how upset I am.
It's terrible, really,
it's an absolute turning point for me.
But you see, when they had Gerald Kaufman, the Manchester Gorton MP who's dying
God rest his soul, my very old and long-standing friend.
Well, he was a Jewish MP who supported the Palestine problems. And I wondered if he was alive, which he's not, how he would have spoken about the anti-Semitism.
He'd have been expelled already, Norma, but we can't go into that. He'd already have been expelled. Norma, God bless you. Thanks very much for the book and for the call. Here's Daniel in Willesden Green. Go ahead, Daniel.
Hello. Good night. Good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
I've noticed in the latest week that sometimes when some people are calling you or you have interviews with some climate change deniers or skeptics, and I wanted to point out something that you need to ask them always.
Okay.
And it's very simple because I'm like you. I'm not a scientist. Okay.
No. So I'm not a scientist either.
Yeah.
But I respect scientists. It doesn't mean I automatically agree with them, or still less that I've got faith in them. That would be very unscientific. But I do listen to a scientist more than the guy next to me filling out his betting slip in the bookies.
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying, and that's the whole point of the scientific methodology, where basically what separates pseudoscientists from real scientists. They don't trust each other either. They need to present proof of evidence for the work the claims they make. You make a claim, you need to prove it. You need to back it up. How do they back it up? They back it up not by opinion, not by polls. We've all heard about this 97% of the world scientists agree, blah, blah, blah. But what they always say is, no, we go to the peer reviews. They go to their own scientific papers. They do their studies. They get their data. They collect it and they present it to the scientific community worldwide. And they need to do the last step to corroborate that data is not manipulated, is trustworthy, and especially that the conclusions are right. Because especially in this case, they need to check the correlation and causation between CO2 and climate change and the effects on the planet, on the climate, on what's going to happen later in the weather in the long run. So they need to do that, those studies. They need to do their research, their investigation. They need to present everything on a presentation for their peer review, and they need to study corroborated and say, okay, we have done our own research. We've checked your data, and that is trustworthy. So therefore, we conclude that your conclusions are correct. And you go to the community, you go to the wide world and say, this is correct. There is a correlation between increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, increase of temperatures. Later, that will have other sort of things that have a long impact on many other areas.
You don't, if you'll forgive the pun, you don't have to be Einstein to work that out. Thanks, Daniel, for a very powerful call. My friend Philza in Ireland points out the obvious. I knew when I said it I was wrong. Malala was not shot in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan by the Taliban. So it was I'm not even sure if it was the Pakistani Taliban or the Afghan Taliban, though they're the same mindset, but Malala was shot in Pakistan. Thanks for that, Philza. The Red Resistance says, we always hear that the right of the party are homeless and may walk away. Well, I hope these people are currently purging our party of the left realise that us lefties who've been defamed on a daily basis for years will walk. Our vote is no longer guaranteed. And Councillor James Ball says, you're absolutely correct, George. If Article 50 ends up being delayed, I think the civil unrest could well approach poll tax territory. Ali in Southwark on the SMS says, as one of those campaigning for GG as mayor, we knew beforehand the consequences of Sadiq. If anyone thinks George is just a great orator, they haven't seen anything. For many years, including the mayoral campaign, I've seen him connect with all backgrounds, open to all critics and challenges. I will not forget the time you met a young woman who was an ex-prisoner, and she wished she'd met a mentor like you in her life. Thank you for that, Ali. I remember that encounter very well indeed. Very kind of you to say, and the best to you. Let's hear from Marty in Belfast. Marty, welcome.
Hi, George. It's been a while.
It has. I'm always happy to hear your accent. Go ahead.
George, I think I was saying to your producer there, I think May will get her deal through.
I think so too, yeah.
And here's why. I think it's been a total shambles. I think the Tories have reduced the British government, not the British people, but the British government to a laughingstock internationally. But here's what I think is going to happen. It may not, but I just have a hunch that this will happen. The backstop, which is obviously important to people here in Belfast and the whole of the North and the whole of Ireland, actually, they're going to split the ERG and the DUP. They're going to offer them a unilateral exit, I think, and it will be a unilateral exit for Britain only, but Northern Ireland backstop will still apply. I think that will split the DUP from the ERG. May will be able to peel off probably somewhere in the region of about 25 to 30 Labour MPs, and the ERG will fall in behind her, and Brexit will be delivered, if not on the 29th of March, then certainly thereafter, pretty soon thereafter.
Well, I think you are onto something, Marty. That may very well happen. I suppose we both need to talk again next Friday and see if we were right or if we were wrong. Thanks indeed for the call. Always love to hear your voice. Malfunctioning Marionette says, honest, if somewhat painful introduction for us by Gigi tonight, but ending with inspirational and hopeful stuff for the future. We can't go on in limbo like this. And V. Coppinger says the metric system is far superior. Converting metric units to other metric units is a breeze. The imperial system is a relic. Well, I'm sure that's true. Scientifically, that's incontestable. The problem, if it is a problem, is that there are a very large number of people like me who don't know metric, who don't think metric, and who like that which we grew up with and that we learned about. I've got a statement, I think. Is this from the Mayor's office? A spokesperson for the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, said, every death as a result of violent crime is an utter tragedy, and the Mayor is determined to lead from the front to tackle the problem. That is why he's funded a new dedicated violent crime task force with nearly 300 police officers focusing on the areas worst affected, and established a new violence reduction unit. This will bring the police together with local councils, the health service, community groups and others to work on helping prevent people from turning to violent crime in the first place. In addition, he has created a £45 million Young Londoners Fund to provide young people with positive alternatives to crime. But Sadiq is clear that we all need to work together to tackle this scourge, starting with Theresa May, urgently reversing her cuts to the Metropolitan Police and Youth Services that she started as Home Secretary and has continued as Prime Minister. So that just came in. I'm glad that we were able to read it out for reasons of balance. And Fra Hughes says the disparity in treatment, sentencing, bail and parole between the classes proves, if proof were needed, that those in the elite echelons of society are put above the law. White upper-class privilege is alive and well in England's green and pleasant land. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, bring another listener with you and come back next week at the same time and in the same place. I've been George Galloway. This has been the mother of all talk shows.